everyone. Thank you for being with us today for our Power in Politics event at Glendale Community College with our esteemed guest, Dr. Caroline Heldman from Occidental College. She's currently working on her 12th book, but before we get into her and all of her expertise, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping. If you are a GCC person and you need sign-in, that will be at the end of the event. I'm happy to give that to any of your professors or for flex verification. Today's event is sponsored by the Social Sciences Division as well as the Glendale College Foundation. We want to thank them for their support. But most of all, we want to thank Dr. Caroline Heldman, who in this really busy a week of the California primary said yes so willingly and has been so amazing to work with and just has such a heart for community college students and the San Gabriel region supporting educators and students. So I want to thank her for being with us. She is a professor and department chair of gender, women, and sexuality studies at Occidental. She is highly involved in every sphere you could think of. So from academia to nonprofits to boards to consulting political campaigns to working with corporations on leadership positions and to protesting on the street. But perhaps one of the most interesting things that faculty were noticing yesterday is that she's also in a cover band, Alice in Chains. So she is a woman of all trades. And we're so thankful she took time out of her busy schedule to share her expertise with us, especially after yesterday's California primary. You might be feeling some type of way. And as we sit here and wait for more results, I think it's really important that we collectively come together, not only to encourage each other and give hope, but to really think about what democracy requires of us and how we can kind of move forward. It's not just about one day a year or one day every 4 years. So without further ado, please welcome Caroline Heldman. Hello.
Oh, Professor Michelle Stonis, it is so good to see you. How wonderful to be with you today. Thank you.
Of course, thank you. I really appreciate it. And please drink coffee as needed. I know you've had a lot of media spots. So let's jump right into it. And please take the questions any direction you would like. And don't worry, audience, we will have time for questions at the end. We would love to hear from you and what's concerning you. But I kind of think one of the first things that came to mind when I knew I'd have the privilege of interviewing you is how should we think about power beyond elected offices and government positions?
Well, when I think about power, I think about, there are lots of different theoretical and social science approaches to defining power. But what strikes me is that you're able to either get resources for things that are valuable to you, or there's a values component to it, right? So if you have power, you have the means and the levers to get things done, whether that's people following you or to get a specific initiative funded. But I think another way, and this is the way that I really engage power, is to think about the second kind of part of power, which is establishing norms and values. And this is where, we get a little bit in, obviously, Michel Foucault talks about the various ways in which we have these systems that are determining power, like biopower, where the state can make a determination, right? And for example, everyone's going to wear COVID or wear masks during COVID or is going to get vaccinated. So I would argue sometimes biopower can be positive, but by and large, it is not, right? It ends up both establishing and reinforcing systems of power. But perhaps like even more directly when we think about invisible forms of power that are way more, shall we say, powerful than the formal systems of power. We think about norms and others, right? So we think about this idea of disciplinary power, where to make it way too simple for the theorists in the room, we establish norms and then we establish humans, right, as being the norm, and then there's the other. So the hierarchies that are implicit in the ways in which we actually think about who has value in a culture and who doesn't. So when I think about power, I think about politics as being the kind of very tip of the iceberg, formal way in which we think about power, and that's resource distribution. So who we elect a public office, who we send the signal that this person is valuable unsustainable, right? The overrepresentation, for example, the long overrepresentation of white men in institutions of power, whether it's social, political, or economic. We've baked this into our constitutional, our founding documents. So women, people of color, women of color, looking at this intersectionally, and a lot of other marginalized people have been formally left out of power. And that's been, it's not a law that's on the books, but it's been baked into our founding documents, practices, et cetera. And so when I look at politics, I'm like, here's this little teeny way in which we're thinking about power, but really what's happening is a mostly invisible but interlocking systems that are determining who has value and who doesn't. And it ends up getting compounded intergenerationally. And I know I'm speaking really kind of in vague terms, but I think for me, something that was a really kind of potent stat that I ran across, which holds true today as an undergrad in a community college, is the idea that the biggest predictor of where you're going to end up socioeconomically is where you're born, right? And so so if you are born into a culture that doesn't value you, or you're a kid of color, let's say you're a Latin kid of color, the biggest, your social position as measured by the proxy of your economic position, it's going to be hard to move up because we talk a good game about opportunity, but the systems of inherent and implicit and unspoken value actually end up sorting us into social positions based upon birth and immutable characteristics.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, right? Of like politics being just one, like the tip of the iceberg, just one like way that power is expressed. And yet we have maybe, I was talking to a student today who felt like the elders in their community, in the Armenian community, felt like because of their lived experience in different regimes, that they didn't have any power, let alone political power. What would you say to someone like that who doesn't even want to participate in the political process, maybe doesn't is distrusting of voting, or doesn't want to participate even in that part of the power they might hold?
Well, I'll say the controversial thing out loud, which is that one vote maybe doesn't matter. It's very rare that one vote matters, right? It's the collective experience of voting. But there's so many different ways to participate and engage in politics and power that have nothing to do with voting. I would say voting is kind of a baseline, right? For me, it's more about expressing my connectivity to the polity, and that, that's a really nerdy way of saying, like, it's a way of expressing my engagement, right, with my community, with, for example, like casting a vote for governor, because I'm a proud Californian, and it gives me this sense, right, that I'm connected to something bigger than myself, which I think is important for humans. The psychologists in the room can speak more to that, but there are also so many ways to participate beyond that, right? So there are conventional political activities like voting, or engaging in a political campaign, or making a political contribution. And then there are all of these unconventional ways of participating, whether that is signing a petition, a protest, creating content online. I would argue a lot of that is very political. Alternative institution building, which is something that I engage in, where I go into a community, ask the community what they need, and then create an institution, and then it is run by the local community. So bringing your skill sets together with the interests and needs of a marginalized community. And there are also really big tools that you can use every day, like consumer activism. And I think this is not, I think, I know this is a more popular one with younger folks, and each successive generation is more likely to vote with their dollars. And so I wrote my dissertation on this topic a while ago. We won't say the year, but finally published it as a book, and it finds, or what I find is that with the rise and the advent of social media, that consumer activist campaigns, they've never really been about economic damage. They've been more about reputational damage, which is harder to control, harder to contain, and harder to predict. So companies will capitulate, not because, gee, this boycott is causing my, bottom dollar to go down right now. It's more, I don't know how it's going to harm my brand to be aligned with this particular cause. So, for example, Target, I would say, really underestimated the reputational damage of having DEI programs serving Latin and Black working class communities and then pulling the rug out, and also queer communities. They have this really interesting mix of, hey, we're gonna profit off of marginalized communities, and then to flip really harmed their brand, went to the core of their brand. So consumer activism, you can boycott, meaning avoiding products or companies that don't align with your values. You can boycott, you can go out of your way. People also call it a girl cot, go out of your way to purchase things that reflect your values. All of these things connect us to something bigger than ourselves. And also, I think are especially good when, for example, we might be boycotting a company because it has, we are people of privilege here in the United States. We're a longtime colonial power, and if we're boycotting, for example, a company that is polluting in another part of the world where people simply don't have the voice or power to rise up against, like a Chevron, for example, then I find that to be a particularly good way of aligning with, for example, feminists or marginalized people in other parts of the globe.
Your mention of voting being a way that we can connect to something bigger to ourselves almost reminds me of voting as prayer. Of it might that one voting, one vote may not matter in that, but you're like connecting to something bigger, and it's your sense of belonging, your sense of like joining into the collective will. If anyone wants to pick that up as a dissertation, you can have it because I'm tired. Um, all right. So there's been a lot of talk with the primary that, California has been dominated. It's one of the big three Democratic strongholds in the country. And it's led some talking heads and observers to talk about kind of diversity of thought or diversity of political party. And, you already mentioned intersectionality, right? And that diversity is a strength. And so we do want diversity, gender diversity, racial diversity, class diversity. But should we think of diversity in terms of political parties or political ideas and viewpoints, or does that get kind of muddy because of the political parties the way they are?
Well, yes, I would consider diversity of viewpoint to be important too. I do actually think we have that in California. In fact, we're seeing it play out so clearly with Javier Becerra, who's more of a centrist establishment Democratic candidate, although it would be the first Latin governor we've had in the modern political age. Of course, California used to be Mexico, and Alta California, we had plenty of Latin governors, but he would be the first in the modern political age. So he is not establishment in all regards, not in terms of representation, for example, but his ideas are way more centrist than a Tom Steyer. And Tom Steyer is, pushing for the billionaire tax. He is a billionaire pushing against the billionaire class. So I see this playing out too in the LA mayoral race with Karen Bass and Nithya Raman, and Karen Bass being more the centrist candidate, and Nithya Raman as a democratic socialist, really pulling that agenda to the left. I think California is painted as a one-party state, but boy, I've worked on legislation in Sacramento, and Democrats don't agree. There's a great deal of variety in the approaches. And yes, when I look at diversity, I'm looking at, gender, race, ability, sexuality, body size, age, class. All of these are important characteristics to understand because they give us, when we're looking at intersectionality, which is this idea of overlapping systems of oppression, don't just equal one plus, one, it doesn't equal two. They operate in different ways. They could compound each other. They could become their own form of bias. So, for example, for Black women in politics, it's not enough to say, oh, well, we'll take this knowledge about Black people, Black men in politics and white women in politics and kind of mix it. It doesn't work that way. So intersectionality calls on us to have a more nuanced understanding of the ways in which identities intersect, and experiences of power and oppression can be unique and situational. And all of this to say it just gives us a better handle on reality. So yes, I want to get, as a social scientist who also loves theory, I want to get as close as I possibly can to small t truth, with the understanding that that truth is elusive, but I'm going to use as much data as I can to get as close as possible.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned too of sometimes having different political ideas too shifts the conversation in ways that might be helpful, or to understand, right, our weaknesses or where to grow. So yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, let's talk about gerrymandering. That's been in the news a lot. And so how do factors like gerrymandering and voting rights influence our democratic institutions?
Well, we are in a terrible state in American democracy. This is not a partisan thing. I mean, I don't appreciate having someone. So I'm a presidency scholar. I should preface it by saying this is my area of specialization in political science, and my heart was broken when we elected a man, not party, not who he is, but a man who. Um, Disrespects the institution so profoundly, maybe doesn't understand the institution. And as we can see, so much of how we've been operating is based upon not so much rules as norms. And we are, this idea that our framers 250 years ago put this system in place. And yes, we've improved upon it, 27 amendments over time. So it's getting better, especially with the first 10, the Bill of Rights, where we established rights. So we have liberties, which are political liberties, are freedom from government intervention, and political rights in a nutshell are the ability to do things. And so we established all of that. We laid out these contours, and then we established a series of norms. And those norms have really just been obliterated in the past decade by one particular man. It's not even the party. I have a lot of Republican friends who are, really horrified about the institution and what's happened to the institution of the presidency. And for me, I look at this as, yes, this too shall pass. We will get reasonable Republicans in that office. We will get reasonable Democrats in that office. They will do what they can to restore it. But at the end of the day, perhaps the biggest kind of democratic threat has been what is longer lasting, which is what the Supreme Court is doing. And I'm finally getting to your question, which is the Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act. And if you recall, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, right after we fought a bloody civil war, Black men on paper were given the right to vote. Black women, that wouldn't happen until 70 years later with an amendment, but it really wouldn't happen at all until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The fact that we had to put in Voting Rights Act 100 years after we supposedly gave, Black men the right to vote tells you everything about how they were disenfranchised. And the idea that somehow we don't still have those problems. I mean, we just do. We can look at a lot of evidence finding that, for example, in Louisiana, you have about 40% African Americans in the state and almost no representation in Congress. So the gerrymandering is a problem. It's a problem that Donald Trump started this gerrymandering mess. And I should take it back, actually. It started pre Donald Trump. It started with a case known as Shelby, a Supreme Court case where they started chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is, again, we can now say as of a month ago that it's just been obliterated. But this started back in 2012 and went into effect in 2013, where we started to say, well, we don't need these requirements. We're not going to watch states. So we got rid of something called federal preclearance, which is, hey, if you're from a state that has a history of disenfranchising Black voters, then if you pass significant changes to your elections, to your voting laws, then you actually need the federal government to step in and review that. We got rid of that. As soon as we got rid of that, states started to gerrymander. And gerrymandering is a practice where you draw districts where the legislature draws districts to choose voters instead of voters being able to choose representatives. So you get these absurd maps where, some of them extend for hundreds of miles and they have city dwellers and people who have nothing in common with city dwellers all the way over here. It's a bad scenario. And Donald Trump, for those who are not paying attention to politics closely, he asked Texas to redraw their maps to get additional seats for Republicans because he's rightfully worried about losing the House of Representatives come November. And in response to that, California and a series of other states also proposed gerrymandering. The state of California, Gavin Newsom tried to do it a little bit better in that he put it up for a vote for the people. We all might remember Prop 50. We passed it. We got 5 additional seats for Democrats in California. All of this is disgusting. Is it necessary to save democracy for the Democrats to get in the mud too? I would argue yes, because it's not simply a matter of, hey, we're tinkering with numbers. What is liable to happen is if the Republicans are able to get the supermajority they would like in the House of Representatives, that might lead to national election law changes, which is the ultimate goal. So if you look at some of the proposals that are coming from the White House and from the extreme MAGA branch of folks in Congress, you will see that the plan is to permanently disenfranchise Democratic voters who are disproportionately older voters, voters of color, women, queer voters. So there is reason to be really concerned about this, and that is my very long diatribe about where we are and how we get out of this is we folks who care about democracy set party aside. Party makes us all a little stupid, right? But look at it from a perspective of democracy. Like, what is the end game of the folks who are gerrymandering? Do we gerrymander in return? Yes, we do, in order to preserve our democratic republic.
No, that's a lot of food for thought. And I know we have a lot of history students who are attending. So I'm hoping that you just made an excellent case why understanding historical context matters, right? Because it's not something that just happened in the recent past or under one president, right? But we look back and rewind and see that, right, the chipping away and the gutting that leads to where we're at today. So thank you for giving us that context. A lot of your work focuses on gender and like women's participation or lack of equity in political representation. So have increases in women's political representation changed policy outcomes in meaningful ways? Like, does it matter that we have more women?
It does matter. We have plenty of studies now that find that. Many of them are global. Some of them are based in the United States. So we know that there are differences between how men and women govern. And I will put a big asterisk. These are not like biological or essential or natural differences. This has a lot to do with socialization and what we expect of men and women in leadership roles. So we know, for example, that women are more likely than men to take multiple factors into consideration when passing policy. So men on average will just look at a couple of factors when determining whether or not they want to advance or vote yes on a policy or vote it down, and women will consider far more. We also know that women are more likely to propose legislation, especially at the state legislative level. They're more likely to carry bills or propose bills. They're more likely to get them passed. So there's some efficacy differences too. And much of that has been linked to kind of the third big area where we found a difference, and that is in collaboration and communication. And it often happens across party. We also know in countries around the world that when women get into positions of leadership, that rates of women participating in government go up. Political efficacy, which is the belief that your one voice matters in politics, that goes up. We also see positive environmental outcomes. So there's a more liberal policy agenda globally for women leaders. So there are many kind of benefits to getting more women into public office. And of course, we want to look at this through an intersectional lens that the most underrepresented folks are women of color, especially in the United States when it comes to political power.
Yeah, exactly. Which ties into gerrymandering too. Um, so perhaps you've seen the sentiment maybe on a water bottle with your undergrad or graduate students of I support women's rights and wrongs. And maybe you've heard, whether it's social media or from students, maybe facetiously or not, of like if all women, if women were all the political leaders and we wouldn't have these problems, right? Or the answer to being a pacifist and to not supporting war would be like having more women in these official government positions. And so I was wondering if can democracy ever be truly neutral with respect to gender, and should it be? Because you're providing evidence, right, that the outcomes, the efficacy is actually better when we do have women serving. So how do we kind of balance that with democracy being truly neutral around gender?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I would argue that if all women were in 100% of leadership positions, then no, we would get a great variety in how women lead. We're talking about averages here, right, between male leaders and female leaders. But a lot, I would argue, too, has to do with socialization, right? That we, for example, don't expect men to be as caring for family, children, and kin keeping as we do women. So it makes total sense that when they get into positions of political power, they're going to focus less on those issues. And when women get into positions of power, they're going to focus more. I think the moral of the story is that our descriptive representation is important. So we have two basic types of representation when you're thinking about political leadership. One is descriptive, meaning, does my political leader look like me in some fundamental identity ways? So, for example, a woman member of the House of Representatives would represent me or match me as a woman. And then there's substantive representation, which is that, hey, you don't actually maybe look like me. We don't share the same identity in some profound way, but you represent my interests. And I would argue that that while descriptive representation is important, right? It's important that our political leaders roughly look like the demographic makeup of the folks they're representing. What maybe is more important is that our political leaders, regardless of their identity, are actually representing the diverse interests of their constituents. So, for example, men who are focused a lot on reproductive rights, even though it only affects them secondarily. So, yeah, we need to get better across the board in terms of substantive representation and caring more about people with whom we don't share an obvious identity with. But at the end of the day, political leadership is, and I we attract, I'm going to make a general statement here, but we attract people who are power seeking. And I go back to, this idea of this kind of Plato and Aristotle, and think about who leaders should be, and philosopher kings and queens are really, ideally, they're people who, and I'm being too simple for the theorists, I get that, but I want to pull one point out, which is these are often people who don't want to be leaders, right? They're not power seeking. So human beings, we're a pretty profoundly selfish species. And then you take the most selfish kind of subset of our species, and then we put them in charge. And I think, we all kind of know that and see that. And I would love to shift that.
Yeah, that kind of ties into a follow-up question then, which is it morally, I don't know if I want to say morally, but is it in our best interest as a democracy to have career politicians, people who this is their permanent position or station in life, or is it not? Because I can see the argument both ways, right? Of you gain experience and you network and you're right, it takes a long time. It's not something that's a flash in the pan. It takes, can take decades to build a coalition. But then when your own vested self-interest and economic interests are tied to your political representation, then maybe you're not representing the people that you're supposed to. What thoughts do you have on that? Should we all cry?
So many. Let's cry. Yeah, Professor Stone. I mean, it's complicated, right? So you're pointing out the pros, which is that, in a state like, let's just take California, for example, it takes years to learn the system. It takes years to become proficient in whatever committees or specific policies are assigned to you. And we want our public representatives to be experts. But what happens along the way, because our elections are very expensive, is corporate capture, right? And so corporate capture, meaning that corporations have an undue influence in policy outcomes, not only what gets on the agenda, but what gets passed. And it's hard to untangle because there's so much money in politics going in so many different directions. But we do have a couple of really great national studies finding that indeed, corporations have a lot more influence than individual citizens. You just look at the lobbying numbers. Corporate lobbyists outnumber citizen lobbyists about 30-1 on K Street in Washington, D.C. And there are lots of ways to measure this. But so one of the cons is that this corporate capture. But what happens when you when you don't address the outsized role of corporations in politics, and then you cycle through politicians and they don't get that expertise and they don't get that seniority, it actually makes it easier for corporations to manipulate them. They become more reliant on the expertise and the data that's being provided by lobbyists. So there's no good answer to this. I would say it would require a fundamental shift of how money is involved in politics, and it would require a fundamental shift in allowing corporations to have such undue influence. And if we don't address that, then term limits and these sorts of things actually make our political leaders even more vulnerable to corporate interests.
Yeah, this is your area of expertise. So would that be Citizens United, or there are other areas in which we should be kind of focusing on in terms of money and politics?
There's not to depress everyone, but there's this prevailing theory well before Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court case that basically opened the floodgates of corporate money in politics. I will say the floodgates were like this far open, it was already happening. But there's a theory called the hydraulic theory, which is that it doesn't matter what sort of limitations you put on money in politics, the water or the money will find its way in. And I think I am an optimist, so I don't think we have the answer for getting money out of politics. I think it would require a really fundamental shift actually in the way it would require something, a hybrid of capitalism. So it would actually require a fundamental shift to our economic system. And I will go a step further and say, our economic system of capitalism, where you amass wealth and power, and the more kind of wealth you have, the more political power you can amass, and then you set the rules to benefit you, and then you have a small number of billionaires at the top who are dictating policy, and you get this growing gap between the rich and the poor, and you get real wages that are frozen or declining, and you have the rise of service sector jobs where people can work 40 hours a week, and they are the working poor. They can't pay their bills even working full time. That economic system is incompatible with democracy. If we think about what democracy is, demos, right? For the people, what ends up happening if you just take capitalism that's unfettered, right, or essentially unfettered in our contemporary political system, it will, over time, it will cause corporate capture to the point that constricts democracy. So capitalism and democracy are fundamentally incompatible, not something we think enough about, but we're actually seeing that right now. We're seeing that with the tech oligarchs showing up at the inauguration, having this profound influence on shaping not just our economy, but also, the emergence of AI and how this is happening, and the lack of, the lack of accountability and oversight of AI, and then the lack of oversight on social media. And we now have a decade where we've beta tested profoundly damaging, harmful products on an entire generation. Now we're into our second generation of young people. And of course, they have the highest rates of depression and mental health issues of any generation since we've been measuring it. They are very lonely. I mean, we teach these young people, and I think, and I apologize to them all the time. And I think to myself, like, what could we have done a decade ago to prevent this from happening? Well, it would have required that our governments be capable and nimble and able to check these massive corporations. And this is just one sector. We could do this for healthcare. We could do this for big oil. We're just doing it right for big tech. And we're only doing one sliver of it, but this is the system we have, and I would argue it's fundamentally incompatible with democracy and also with human thriving, because corporate values are apolitical. They are profit driven. They're not human driven.
Yeah, you bring up a good point too with social media and thinking about how capitalism is incompatible with democracy, because social media too, we've seen, right? It silos people's political ideologies and what they see, right? And convinces them that they are amongst other people, that everyone believes like them, or they're constantly feeding them the algorithm. Are there any practical things that we could support, or besides just bricking our own phone of we're sponsored by Brick, no, just kidding, of how do we push back against this system, and so that we can have like diversity of thought, really learn about these things in a deep way? Would that mean being offline altogether on social media, or how can we navigate that when our government's not going to put those guardrails up for us?
You know, I'm I like to embrace the complexity. So, by the way, I'm not making an argument to get rid of capitalism, but rather to monitor it in a different way that it makes allows it to flourish alongside democracy. In terms of the social media question, there are some basic things we could do. Australia is actually banning cell phone use. for 15 and younger. California is looking at that model. I don't know if I would there's some good data saying that that sort of extreme is needed right now, but certainly keeping it out of schools, helping children monitor their own use, because we all know how addictive it is. And then we act like we're above it. No, we're not. It's addictive. It's way more addictive, right? Like cigarette smoking if you started as a kid. And it's something that's so addictive that I call my students my cherubs, and I love them dearly. And I have a no device policy because I know what it's like to have a device in the classroom. And then I also look at studies that find you're not really present. So I create these spaces of presence where we're really going to dive deep into some hard questions. And my no device policy means that students are getting up to use the restroom. They can't make it through a 55-minute class without this. And I'm not even judging. It is an addiction. And so, yeah, there are lots of things we could do to break that addiction. Common Sense Media, if you go to their website, has some great ideas for that if you're a parent or if you're just a concerned person who wants to disengage. Also, a basic thing about news, and yeah, Michelle, you brought up this really deep point of how it directly affects democracy through disinformation and misinformation campaigns. And I don't think Americans understand well enough how much of this is coming from Russia and China. And it's not just Russia and China, but we have so much evidence and information that these disinformation and division campaigns are being run from other countries, right, with the intention of tearing down our democracy. And we are falling right into it, right? And so, yes, in terms of political news, I focus a lot on this in a class I teach on decoding the news. And the general rule is do not get your news from social media. If the news is finding you, it is likely laced with disinformation. If it's finding you in your algorithm or it's being boosted or paid for, it's finding you, it likely contains something that is trying to convince you of a worldview or a specific policy position. So you have to find your own information. The most reliable source for political information is Politico. It's a little boring. Nerds like me love it. I wouldn't recommend it. I think a really great place to get the news is it's mainstream, but really well research coverage is going to be the New York Times. And I wouldn't recommend the Washington Post anymore, but the New York Times, the best in terms of podcasts and online would be NPR. There's just nothing that beats NPR. And then if you want more of a lighthearted approach, Pod Save America is a pretty great podcast. Now, these are Obama folks, so they're really centrist Democrats. I will say, so they're like slightly to the left, and then the Bulwark podcast is going to be slightly to the right. Tim Miller, lots of different faces over at the Bulwark. So check out the Bulwark, Politico, Pod Save America, New York Times, NPR. Don't let it find you online.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not sure if you've come across this. I share it with my students called All Sides Now, and you can follow them on social media. Like fill your social media with things that you actually, right, can sit there and learn, and they'll show you multiple headlines in a carousel, and you'll realize how they're covered differently based on the slant of the news publication. So to remember, right, of the biases of the sources that you're looking at. On to another happy topic. The Smithsonian American Women's History Museum Act, HR 1329, failed in the House along party lines just about 2 weeks ago, with most Democrats voting no and most Republicans voting yes. So on the surface, it looks a certain kind of way. But if you dig a little deeper, right, there's some underpinnings there. So could you explain the context of why would Democrats not support this bill? What's the broader context? And this, for anyone not familiar, this is the idea and the funding eventually in finding land to make an official Smithsonian's Women's History Museum on the National Mall.
Yeah, and this bill and these efforts have been underway for 2 decades. That's how long folks have been fighting to get women better represented on statues in the mall because it matters, right? Whose stories we tell, who gets to be a hero. Those sorts of narratives matter an awful lot in who is valued in our culture. So the context is, it would seem like, hey, wouldn't it be the opposite? All these Democrats voting to get boost women's representation and Republicans voting against it. Unfortunately, I will say up until Trump took office for the second term, it was actually bipartisan support for this, and has been for most of the time that the bill's been on the table. what happened is they put in a poison pill. If you're not familiar with Republicans, put a poison pill into the bill. And a poison pill, if you're not familiar, is where you don't want a piece of legislation to pass. And so you put something in it that is so odious that you know it will not get the votes. So there were actually two things that were added to this bill to make it so odious, or a poison pill, so that it wouldn't pass. But then you could still, as a Republican, right, or a Democrat, you could still say, well, I voted for it, and then people wouldn't dig deep enough to know that you're getting credit for you actually killed it. So the first thing is that Donald Trump would be able to put the memorial wherever he wanted. So there was concern that he would tuck it away in a place that didn't matter, meaning that it would be hidden. But the second, and this is the bigger concern, I think, for a lot of feminists, there are lots of different types of feminists, but across the spectrum, there was concern from feminists about their designation of women, that it was biological women. So it was excluding trans women or gender non-conforming femmes. And so it was that language that was so concerning to a lot of folks. And that is a really long explanation, but gets at kind of the political process of how you kill a bill, right, in 10 days, if you really want to, and still appear as though you were a virtuous representative.
Sounds like a depressing schoolhouse rock song. How to Kill a Bill. Oh, it's so sad. Okay, looking ahead 20 years, what gives you the most hope and what gives you the most concern about democracy?
Mm. Well, I would say social media gives me the most concern, or disinformation or division that's coming from social media, or a lot of very, limited, primitive, um, conspiratorial thinking. I always knew that our democracy was fragile, right? This is not, we think about it as, I think we're born into systems where we think that they're stable and ever present and will always be and have always been. We are such a young democracy. We are three old people old. So Donald Trump is turning, just for context, Donald Trump is turning 80, right? Three times eight, right? If I'm doing my math, is 240. We're 250 years old. We are three Donald Trumps old. That's it. We are a baby democracy. We have not always been here. It was hard fought. We then fought a civil war just so we would sort of match up some of our values with what we had written 100 years earlier, right? In our Constitution. Not quite 100 years. It is mind-boggling to me how fragile our democracy is. And I think that social media has really revealed the limits of a lot of human capacity, of how much we are driven by emotional politics, and how much we are limited if outside or even internal forces want to turn us on each other, how quickly we will go right there. And I don't say this from a kumbaya position. I am not a pacifist. I am a radical person, but I can also get along with people who don't think like me. And that's actually what democracy is about. And I don't mean like give them a pass when they dehumanize entire swaths of people, but I do want to interact with people in a way that doesn't, I don't want to dehumanize people because they're dehumanizing others. And I know it's a hard road to walk, to not have a lot of anger and rage. And I do have that, and I channel it into activism, right? Whether it's anti-ICE activism, or whether it's survivor activism. But yeah, I'm concerned about our ability as a species to actually do much about this. And I see that there's a question about young people. Young people are not, I'm going to sound pessimistic. I love my students. Um, we are seeing IQ drops. We're seeing critical thinking drops as a result of reliance on social media and AI. And that's not to say that people don't have radical ideas and are not doing great things. Student movements have always been a very important part of our fabric. But I'm also looking at data from Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Gen Z, we have really good data that Gen Z, especially the men, are more sexist than their fathers. So this idea that we're going to be, more progressive and it just naturally happens that way, it's actually not true. So we know that we have an entire generation of men who are more misogynistic and more sexist than their fathers were, right? We see actually greater, so it's uneven. So we see higher rates of sexism, we see lower rates of homophobia, and greater inclusion of queer folks in our politics and our thinking. We also see a greater embrace of racial diversity, although the ways in which that translates doesn't necessarily translate into policy support. So I would say that this idea that young people are simply more progressive and that is happening is not true. We actually see a lot of backsliding. And I think a lot of that has to do with the relentless drumming of the manosphere and other online spaces that are promoting really troubling ideas. We're also seeing a rise in white supremacy, not overall, that it's not showing up in data overall, but these white supremacist spaces online that are very connected to the fitness influencer manosphere. I mean, it just takes a couple of clicks. If you look up law enforcement, military, fitness, or sex questions, you are almost immediately into the manosphere, which will likely take you into white supremacist spaces. So I think that our democracy and the human spirit is really threatened right now because of the power that we have given corporate online spaces that are driven by interests of machination and manipulation. And that sounds like a conspiracy, except the manosphere, Exhibit A, right, which we've been warning about even before the rise of social media, and it has come to fruition. So the question was about hope. I also have endless hope, always in the fight of humans. So as much as I'm bleak about human capacity to manage our current kind of social media landscape and information landscape and partisan, hyper partisan and hate landscape, we can say that. There are always people who are fighting, like always people on the edges, radicals who are envisioning a different world. And so now I'm going to make a pitch for social media. I remember being I'm a gender abolitionist. I actually don't think that gender categories serve an important function in the way in which we organize our lives. So I'm not interested in that as a category, right? So I have a very radical gender position, and I have for a very long time, since an undergraduate, when I was coming up with different terms way before them, right? Coming up with different terms along with Sophie B. Hawkins, who was this great, she sings this song, Damn, Wish I Was Your Love. She was doing the same thing in college, right? Like coming up with terms that kind of, don't require gender. I would love to degender so many things that, it's just they're artificial constructs that end up creating categories or hierarchies that are not necessary. So the categories immediately become hierarchies, let's put it that way. So I could not have imagined where we would be in terms of progress toward gender abolition. As soon as Facebook came about, and I know I'm dating myself, but Facebook started it with their 63 gender categories, which is actually gender, sex, and sexuality all mixed in. Once people started to see the menu of what was possible, forget it. Like the options on TikTok, the options on all these other social media platforms, a majority of Gen Z and now Gen Alpha identify as something other than the binary when it comes to gender, sex, and sexuality. So I will say rapid social progress that has been made or made possible by social media, like the double-edged sword of social media, right? That means that human beings are capable of so many things when it comes to the political imaginary and imagining a world that we want to live in and getting to that world. So it both is really scary for a limited species and also this great avenue for us to imagine better worlds.
Yeah. I love your mention too. It's almost like Mr. Rogers of like look for the helpers too, of like there's always, right, in every part of history, right, when things are the bleakest, it's who's pushing back. And then right now they're on a shirt or now they're on a card, but like those people are living today, right? Historical people aren't historical until after the fact. And so to be inspired, right, by the people that you're around. Rose asks, what is one misconception people have about feminism or gender equality?
A lot of people think that feminism is a dirty word because it means that you're man-hating, but it doesn't matter what definition of feminism we can use, like the standard definition of liberal feminism, that it's the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes or the genders. It's about equality. It's not about hating. It's not about putting others down. Matriarchy is not the mirror of patriarchy, right? The rise of matriarchy would be making sure everybody has a seat at the table and pursuing equality rather than one category over the other. So yeah, really common misconception. I will add to that, there's also a common misconception that there's only one type of feminism, and there are at least 18 major branches, and none of us agree on
I was
anything.
gonna say,
So,
and they don't agree. And that's one of the student learning outcomes for the class I'm teaching, which is, right, like movements are supposed to have diversity within them. Just because they're not, quote, unified doesn't mean that they're not actually onto something, right? Anytime you get more than two people in a room, you're gonna have disagreement. So, thank you for bringing that up.
Professor Stonis, I think about this as even the feminisms which I am not drawn to, they repel me. I think that there's something like fundamentally wrong about them. Like I'll put it out there, psychoanalytic feminism, studied a lot, kind of gives me like, ooh, it's a little too essential for me. I will still look at it and say, oh, there's something to be gained from this. Because if enough people think this and they're really smart people and I respect them, then okay, I'm going to look at this. I'm going to listen to that. I'm going to take something from it. So at the end of the day, you end up studying all these different types of feminism and it's hard to land. You might land on like one anchor, but you're going to be pulling from all of these different ideas.
Agreed. It almost, I'm assuming you saw Suffs when it came through LA, right? And so this idea wait your turn, of trying to remember, right, that different groups have different things that there are their utmost priority and to respect that. But also kind of reminds me, one of my daughters likes to like verbally spar. And, I try and practice of what can we agree on before we get into the weeds. We actually probably do agree on several things that if like maybe we focused on those first, instead of asking me about abortion on Mother's Day. I was like, of all days, like this is what we're talking about today. Um,
We love those women. We love those girls.
he is a fighter, that's for sure. I'm gonna take some responsibility for that one. So Patrick asks, do you think if things get bad enough, we could ever see a more permanent solution, like an amendment to gerrymandering?
Um, Yes. So I think the first thing we should do, we meaning people who care about democracy, I don't care which party is probably going to be the Democrats, though, if they get into power in Congress, get enough of a majority, can work with their Republican colleagues across the aisle and pass some national legislation. I will say the amendment process is harder, right? It's a two-thirds, three-fourths. So two-thirds of Congress or two-thirds of the states decide that they want to take up a question, and then it has to be passed by three-quarters of the states. So it is a very long and arduous process. My thought would be that it would probably happen more likely in Congress. And we think about this pendulum swinging, right? And the pendulum doesn't just swing, meaning the pendulum swings toward human progress and then back again. We are in a back again position, right? We're seeing a lot of our rights and liberties even eroded. But here's the hope. We push that pendulum, and it does tend to swing harder when we overcorrect. So everything that's happening now in terms of violations of rights and gerrymandering and what's happening with U.S. citizens dying in the streets and immigrants and migrants being rounded up and detained. These sorts of things are not something that good democracy-minded Americans should accept. I don't care what political party you're with. Like these are things that are intolerable. And so I have a lot of faith, we will swing that pendulum really far over here. So I think now, and people are already starting to do this, start to think of what you want the world to look like after this.
Yeah, that's really good. Speaking of amendments, do you think we'll see the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment? I
I
mean,
do.
okay.
Actually, in our lifetime,
Actually in
you
our
know,
lifetime, and actually not the like verbal creation of worlds that we have now, like, but it actually is an amendment. Like, no, actually like certified, we're printing out new constitutions type of permanency.
no. So, long story short, and Professor Stonis knows this as well or better than I do. The Equal Rights Amendment simply includes women in the Constitution. It would raise our level of protection in lawsuits. For example, we couldn't have overturned Roe had a constitutional amendment been in place. I think that's the most obvious example of what difference it would make. And it was, initially proposed in I think it was 1923, and then
Well then.
Yeah, I mean, like, remembering the years, and then finally, right, gets considered, passes the two-thirds threshold, and then goes to three-quarters of the states, and was ultimately, I worked on the passage in the last two states. It was ultimately passed, but passed the deadline, except that deadline was arbitrary. It's the only constitutional amendment that's ever had a deadline, and it's not even clear that you can put a deadline on it because that's not part of the constitutional process. It's not in the Constitution. And the last amendment, the 27th Amendment, that members of Congress couldn't raise their own salaries, took 203 years to pass. So it's questionable that they wouldn't that there's any time limit on this whatsoever. But also in the process, 12 states have repealed it, and so there are all sorts of constitutional issues. This Supreme Court, our lifetime Supreme Court, probably not going to pass it.
Yeah, as a whole, that'll be the next event we do about the Supreme Court. What issue affecting women today do you think should receive more attention?
I think the manosphere and the GLP-1 culture aimed at
Mm.
girls and young women.
Yeah.
Um, the amount of hatred and body modification and surgery that we have normalized, the filler that we have normalized, and the using GLP-1s for anything other than health. I mean, that entire cultural machine that is promoting self-hatred for young girls and women, and then the manosphere for young boys and men. I think we just need to have a lot of empathy, but also be very clear-headed that this is profoundly damaging. I would also add one more thing, the content of pornography. Whether you're pro or against porn, I think the content of pornography, as we've seen pop culture become more pornified, porn, proper actual porn, has had to distinguish itself through greater violence and degradation. So now we've, for example, normalized choking, which has in through porn, it's now a regular routine sexual practice for young people. There's no such thing as safe choking. We're now seeing the effects of it. So not only is it a gendered practice where it's almost always young women who are being choked, we're now starting to see brain damage in women in their 20s. There, you can actually look at a brain scan and know whether or not a young woman is engaging in this act either sparingly or on a routine basis. And there's a reason why the UK has now outlawed this in porn. I can't think of a more obvious sort of, this has profoundly terrible effects for young women. And I would argue for young men, that's a whole other line of argument about what it means to normalize such a violent act in sex. And we can't have this conversation because then you talk about kink shaming. And I'm like, well, you know what? We have women with brain damage in their 20s. I'm going to say something.
Yeah. Oh, and it ties into social media as well. And the average age of children being exposed to porn now is 8, usually from a device. So we're going to end there. But thank you so much. Even though some parts of this I think were a little heavy, it's a great reminder that there are experts like you out there, like showing us the way, showing us how to think about the context and about like, I mean, I learned a lot new too of, the kill pill and kind of thinking about the ways that our legislation maybe doesn't represent us and how can we just not feel despondent the day after, but what do we do from there? So thank you for taking time in your very busy schedule and just speaking to us and inspiring us. It was wonderful and we appreciate you coming. Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
so much, Professor Stonis.
Bye.